Welcome everybody, this afternoon at the Erasmus Pavilion. My name is David Boeren and I work here at Studium Generale, where I organize lectures, debates, workshops, movie screenings, and more for students but also for other interested people. And this afternoon we have a geopolitical lecture in store for everybody, because while the Western world seems to be mostly focused on the upcoming American elections this fall, there's another and maybe even bigger election happening right now in India. With almost 1 billion possible voters, the biggest democracy of the world is going to the polls in the coming 6 weeks, so a lengthy process. What is currently happening in the country with today's largest population? Will Narendra Modi get a third term? And what can we expect of this nuclear power in the years to come? To answer these questions today, I have invited an expert on international and the national political situation in India. He is an associate professor of international relations at the Institute of Political Science at Leiden University, where he has been researching foreign and national policymaking, the politics of power transition in the global order, and the international politics of South Asia. In addition, he has been a visiting fellow at various research institutions based in New Delhi. This lecture will take about 45 minutes after we have ample time for discussion and questions. Please welcome on stage Dr. Nicolas Blarel.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, seems to be working. So thank you very much, David, for this kind introduction, and thank you all for coming on this nice day with the weather to hear about. There's a lot of elections happening in 2024, and maybe we're concentrating a lot on whatever is happening in the U.S. election. Will Trump actually be able to run, or etc., or the European Parliament elections? But there's obviously something that has started on Friday and which will last until June 4, is the Indian elections, which are again, by scale, the biggest in the world, and so I'm happy to talk a little bit about this because I don't think there's starting to be some coverage, but I think there's still a lot that could be unpacked. Whether it is about what's at stake, are these competitive elections? Will Modi get a third term? And maybe something that I also am interested in, given my own research interest in international relations, is also focusing on the foreign policy implications. What will India do after the election if Modi is reelected, or if there's an alternative coalition that comes to power? On that note, I would like to also thank Studium Generale in Rotterdam for the invitation, obviously, and hopefully I'll also expect a lot of hopefully good questions. I'll keep it to 45 minutes, and so we have plenty of time. Just one caveat also, there's a lot that can be discussed about the Indian elections. There's a lot of coverage. So I might be simplifying, going very quickly with some things, some technical issues. So for the purpose of clarifying, maybe keep your question to the Q&A, and I'm happy discussing it a little bit further. And hopefully when we simplify, we might also raise some criticism or comments. So obviously those are also welcome after the talk. On that note, what I'm going to do is I don't take it as given that everybody is closely familiar with in the Indian elections or the Indian electoral process. So I'll do a little bit of description of a couple of facts, basically institutional mostly, but also covering a little bit what are the forces in play at the Indian elections. So what is there actually to know about the Indian elections that started on Friday? I'll go then to the political analysis. What are the main issues and stakes for these particular election, the 2024? What's maybe different compared to previous elections? And then I'll finish by what I mentioned, is talking more specifically about the interlinkages between domestic and international politics in the context of South Asia and India especially. Is there actually any link between these elections? Increasingly, and I'll discuss this a little bit later, is that foreign policy becomes more and more of a campaign electoral issue. And vice versa, then the manifestos of the different parties have a lot of foreign policy, basically ideas, principles, and potential decisions that could be implemented after the election. So I'll talk about these three different things. And then first to start with the fact sheet, this is the 18th Lok Sabha, so lower assembly votes that are happening. It's a parliamentary democracy. The first elections were held in 1951, 1952, right after the constitution was adopted. And what is important to know about Indian elections is that for the first election, right after India became independent, there was immediately universal franchise, right? So it went directly into being a full electoral democracy, and these, despite the scale, large population in India and large number of eligible voters, as these have been held regularly for 5 years since 1951, with a hiatus of 2 years in the 1970s during the emergency. So, as I said, it's a federal parliamentary republic. So you might hear that there's a president in India, but it's mostly a ceremonial figure, elected indirectly by the low and high assemblies. But mostly, what's the most important elections at the national federal level are the low assembly votes, the Lok Sabha votes, and usually the party that gets the majority or the coalition gets the majority gets to name the government. What's also important to know, as I said, it's a federal country, so you will have every 5 years national assembly votes, but you might hear that there are always elections going on in India. What happens is that you have a lot of local or state assembly votes that are happening regularly. So you have the National Assembly votes, and then the following years, usually we call them sometime midterm or by-elections, is state assembly votes, so at the level of the 28 states within the Indian Federation. Another important institutional fact is that it's a first-past-the-post voting system, right? So within the electoral district, the candidate with the most votes, it might not be an absolute majority, but even if a plurality, if he's ahead of the other candidates, he or she will be representing that district. So first-past-the-post voting system, it actually is a legacy to some degree of the Westminster model. The Indian Constitution built in the 1950s a lot from different Western European political models, including from the UK. So that's one of those legacies. So obviously you see some distortion between the percentage that vote for certain parties and actually their actual bigger number representation sometimes in the parliament, in the National Assembly. And I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. So that's first setting a little bit the institutional stage. To know a little bit about the sheer scale of the Indian election, that in 2019, they were about, and we're expecting a little bit more, obviously, they were 969 million registered voters out of population. Now it's the most populated country in the world, 1.44 billion, and about 60% of them turned out to vote in 2019. So you can calculate it's roughly 650 million people regularly vote, right? And that number, so it's, in absolute terms, it's huge, obviously, but also if you look at voter turnout, that's increased over the decades in India. It's a figure that a lot of Western established democracies would also like, right? Having that much turnout. It's more impressive in India given the scales. And actually, I mentioned the state assembly votes; those happening at the local level, those actually attract more and more voters, right? So they go more to 70 or higher % turnouts. Another important feat is 48% voter are women, right? So this is a number that's gone up quite dramatically over the last few years. More and more women, female voters have participated, have felt politically empowered, and often vote differently than the rest of the household, right? So this is also something that's been interesting. It's not just more female voters, but also an electorate that is not completely predictable if you follow traditional household political opinions, etc. So it's also a new dimension. Now it's more voters, but it doesn't mean automatically more female candidates for MPs within the Indian Parliament. It's lower than 10% right now. Our candidates for the coming Lok Sabha elections are female candidates. So that political empowerment to some degree, to feel able to participate in the political process by voting, by selecting the National Assembly, but not enough right now to be an actual direct political actor by being an MP. That will change. Some of you might have followed. There was a reform last year that will be implemented in the coming decade to include a third of national and state assembly MPs should be female candidates, right? So that will lead to an important structural, social, and political change, but that's something to see how it's going to happen, how it's going to be implemented. Another important fact, and can explain maybe still some of the fluctuation or uncertainty maybe for the election, to some degree conditional uncertainty, I'll explain that. There's 18 million new voters, right? So obviously India India is now the biggest population. It's got a strong demographic expansion. So obviously there are 7 to 8 million potential new voters every year in that raised 18 or plus electoral voting age. So obviously we are participating for the first time in this particular election. And obviously, so that and the female voters are electorates, which the different parties are obviously trying to fight for, because these are new electorates or expanding electorates that could have a decisive say in the coming elections. So that's some of the forces at play. Another institutional fact that you should know, it's the number of seats in the current Indian parliament, 543 seats. It's actually 545. But that's another legacy from the 1950s and decolonization. 2 are reserved for the Anglo-Indian community, which is very small right now, but it's a small community which has reserved seats. But at play for the election, 543 seats. So you can guess that the majority, the absolute majority for a party or a coalition party should be around 271 seats. 62 national, for this elections, you have 62 national and state parties. So what do I mean by national and state parties? So your national parties are parties that basically have a cross-national appeal, right? That run both at the federal and state level, so at the national and state level, and basically have the capacities or a number of candidates to be able to to have a candidate in most constituencies at the national level. Not in all constituencies, but in most. And there are only a few national parties, and obviously the ones that are really important is you might have heard, is the Indian National Congress. Historically, since independence, has been present, was part of the decolonial, post-colonial movement. And then you have the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, Narendra Modi's party, that's the incumbent party, that are national parties. You have the Communist Party of India, or a couple of the different Communist parties of India are national parties, and state parties are parties that mostly run at the local level, that mostly run in local constituencies. So they can get to have quite a few seats, because you have some states of important population like Uttar Pradesh, and will get a lot of seats in parliament. But they're mostly still strong in local regional constituencies. So you have national and state parties. And often what you'd get, because of this fragmentation, you get electoral alliances, coalitions, between national and state parties. The most famous ones, the ones that are really running against each other for this current election, is the one that's incumbent in power, the National Democratic Alliance, led by the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP. And you have the new coalition that emerged last summer, in summer of 2023, India, the Indian National the Democratic Inclusive Alliance, sorry, yeah. So that's led mainly by Congress, but as 20 plus parties within the coalition. So it's a very big, disparate, kind of almost a little bit divided coalition. It's the main thing that holds them together is their opposition to the BJP and the NDA alliance. And a few of members have actually already left the alliance since the last summer. Some have actually joined the NDA since then. But I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So this is some of the important facts to know about the election. One other thing that I already referred to and was mentioned by David at the beginning, the elections last 44 days, like 6 weeks. What is that, right? So the elections are held in 7 phases. They started last Friday, and we'll get the official results only on June 4. And these are the 7 phases, and you see the different districts, electoral districts, and the different colors about the different phases. So we had the first phase on Friday, so you see here the yellow states that were districts that were actually voting already on Friday and in the first few hours. This is mainly explained by the Electoral Commission. Electoral Commission, if you're a political scientist following Indian elections, you're impatiently waiting for the Electoral Commission conference, because that's when they explain the number of phases. That's when they give a little bit of the which districts will be first voting and which number of phases, and you get a little bit of an understanding on the process will unfold over the next few weeks. And it was held very late this year, and they first announced the number of phases, because it's never, obviously the duration of the process is never the same, and this is arguably one of the longest elections to be held So there were a lot of questions about that. But the process is basically explained by density and population of districts and geography, right? The accessibility of certain electorates within certain districts. The problem is that you basically have as I said, close to 1 billion eligible voters. We said that 650 maybe actually turn up for votes. But you have basically 1 million polling stations across 28 states and 8 union territories. And there's a rule that the Electoral Commission has imposed even since the 1950s, the Electoral Commission that supervised the election, as I said, that every voter needs to be, a polling station needs to be within 2 kilometers of each voter, right? So that means that because of the density, because of the remoteness or the accessibility of certain districts, they need to be sure that they can move around electronic voting machines, basically, that are used for the election. They need to move around the people that supervise the voting and also the security. It's a highly securitized, protected process, right? So this means this can explain the logistics, the complicated logistics of the scale because of the number of people that vote, but also you have some very difficult and remotely accessible districts, right? You're talking about the highest polling stations, for instance. That's a feat that the Electoral Commission likes to bring up. There's one that's close to 5,000 kilometers high in the Himalayas, I believe in Himachal Pradesh or Uttaranchal. Basically, these are the highest polling stations, and you need to be sure that these are accessible within 2 kilometers for every voter. And I think in Arunachal Pradesh, up here in the northeast of India, they need to get a polling station for just 1 voter close to the Chinese border. So the logistics are quite important, and they can explain, that might explain the 7 phases. Now, there's a lot of criticisms that have been brought up, because a lot of commentators have argued that it's not necessary to have that many phases, to need 44 days. We didn't need that in the past. So some are arguing that because the Electoral Commission had a lot of changes in the days before that conference that I mentioned, some named by the current government in power, that this could favor the electoral campaigning of the BJP, notably trying to get Modi to campaign in some of the districts where the BJP hasn't done as well in past elections because he's got a strong personal charisma, and so they needed to get him to campaign, notably in Tamil Nadu or West Bengal. So those have been some criticism. The other criticism is that if this moves all the way to June, you're expecting peak temperatures, right? So what is that going to give? How is that going to impact participation when you have heat waves of 45 to 50 degree in some of those potential districts where voting will happen in the last few phases? So just to give you an idea of some of the important facts and the sheer scale and the logistical difficulties of upholding these elections in the Indian context. So beyond the institutional issues, let me talk to you about also the political landscape a little bit and what are the major contenders. I already referred to them. One fact that you should know, though, is since the early 1990s, because I mentioned the NDA and the India Alliance, which was actually the India Coalition, was previously named, not exactly the same alliance, but was still led by the Indian National Congress, was called the UPA before. It was the United Progressive Alliance, which was in power from 2004 to 2014, and has been renamed India with slightly different type of partners or coalition partners. But mainly since the 90s, you had coalitions in power, but whether it's NDA or UPA, and that's why it was called a bipolar party system. Before that, from the 1950s, so I mentioned this first elections happening in 51, 52, all the way to the late 80s, early 90s, you had maybe more of a unipolar or one-party system. The Indian National Congress, the party that came out of the decolonial movement, was run by Generale Nehru, who was the first Prime Minister of India, and then his successors basically had ruled India for most of its existence until the early 90s. And then the INC started losing elections, or there was a more fragmented political parliamentary system, and you had coalitions, important coalitions that were in power, usually led by Congress or the BJP. The BJP was elected the first time with a coalition in 1998. And these coalitions could have 10 to 12 parties. That was usually the the structural feature after that. So we have since then a bipolar party system. Now the question is this changing because the BJP now has been in power since 2014. Could they eventually be re-elected? That's what the polls are saying. And one important thing to note is that it's actually the BJP is winning absolute majority in number of seats in parliament without the support of its coalition. So the NDA is still running. It's still a coalition running. It's still a coalition that's been elected. But the BJP has enough votes to rule by itself. It doesn't need the NDA. It doesn't need the coalition. Now, let's see if that's still the case in 2024. But today, so you have the BJP and the NDA, which is the incumbent ruling coalition. And I was mentioning first past the post, and now it distorts a little bit the kind of number of votes and the actual number of seats. There you basically, the BJP and NDA together have 37% of the vote, which gave him 303 seats in 2019. So that's, see, a comfortable majority if we consider 271 to be the threshold. And so this is mainly run by Prime Minister Modi. You've all known his personality. He's actually maybe more popular than his own party. And he's not only popular in India, but at the international level, if you look at international polls and not just local polls, national polls, that's the ruling coalition. And you see here the symbols are very important because I also didn't mention that when I talked about the polling station, is because India is a multilingual, very multilingual country, and especially in the early stages of Indian democracy, when you had 80% of the population that was illiterate, the symbols for different parties were very important for people to identify with particular partisan political lines. So you have the symbols here are very important, and I'll show you also the Indian National Congress one. So the Congress, Indian National Congress led India, that coalition only got close to 20% of the vote and only 52 seats in the last parliamentary election in 2019. What you have to know about the INC, so I mentioned it's got this important history, right? It's the first party that dominated and led India, ruled India. And Nehru, as I said, General Nehru, another very charismatic, important political personality that ruled India from 1950s all the way to 64 when he died, basically he's had quite a few successors as prime ministers, but a lot of them were actually part of his dynasty, right? There's also a thing in India about political dynasties, whether at the national or local levels. And this is here the personality that some say is more or less leading the India coalition and could be prime minister if there's an India coalition that wins. And he's basically the great-grandson of General Nehru, right? Nehru's daughter, Indira Gandhi, also ruled India. Her son, Rajiv Gandhi, so Rahul Gandhi's father ruled India in the 1980s, and now Rahul Gandhi is a candidate for the coming elections. You might have seen debates. You saw, I think it was on the New York Times this weekend or last week in The Economist. Could this be the last Gandhi, right? Could this be the last candidate within the Gandhi dynasty to run, especially if he loses? Then are there going to be any other members of that dynasty to run or to rule or to be at the head of Congress, or should Congress move on and have other candidates? And just a qualifier also for those that are not familiar with the Nehru-Gandhi family or Indian politics, it has no connection with the Mahatma Gandhi, right? It's a separate family. It was Indira Gandhi's the daughter of Nehru's husband, Feroz Gandhi, a different Gandhi, and then they took that name afterwards. So Rahul Gandhi, Narendra Modi, the two big faces of the two coalitions. I mean, obviously, a very lopsided kind of a landscape with a strong advantage to the incumbency, as we already mentioned. And then you have a series of other national, I mentioned the communist parties, but also regional parties. So for instance, in southern India, you have two big parties. In Tamil Nadu, for instance, the state of Tamil Nadu, the AIDMK or the DMK are two important regional parties, are not support more or less, well, actually the AIDMK is not with coalition, and the DMK is supports the India coalition. So depending, regional parties might run on their own or support directly or indirectly some of these coalitions. So those are the political forces at play for the coming election. Obviously, very succinctly, we can talk a little bit more about some of the political history behind these different movements. and these different personalities that are Narendra Modi and Rahul Gandhi. Let's talk a little about what are the issues at stake, right? There's a lot that could be discussed about what are the salient issues for this coming election. I'll mention a couple of them that have been discussed a lot in the coverage of the election. And one of them is obviously, and this is not just an issue about India, but it's obviously an issue that comes up a lot in many elections, is the numbers in unemployment. If you look at the national figures, and again, figures are complicated. There's a lot of different figures, whether you look at national institutions, international institutions giving out some of the figures, and these tend to evolve and get corrected over time. There's a lot of politicization of the indicators, the data that is published by different institutions. So take these very carefully. But roughly, unemployment at the national level is high, but not so important. I mean, 8.7% is comparable maybe to other established or emerging economies. But what is important to note is how if you disaggregate that data is actually very strong for the youth aged 2024. And remember, as I said, you have a youth bulge or a demographic expansion in India that led it to become the most populated and one of the youngest countries in the world. And 28 is the median age right now in India, so 44.9% of unemployment for youth aged 2024. So obviously it affects an important part of the population that just that reaches the working age or comes out of higher education. So it actually impacts both the people with low or high education. So this is an important issue for India, and the other issue is only 28% of women are formally employed. The same population, I would say, that was increasingly politically empowered and participating in elections. So if you disaggregate the data, we're basically seeing jobless growth or important issues of unemployment, especially for younger population that can't find jobs in the new Indian economy that is growing. 8% GDP growth approximately in 2023. Again, the numbers fluctuates between 6 and 8% depending on some different institutions with different figures, but again, roughly 7 to 8% is something that comes up in consensually, but that is not leading to many new jobs. It's not a labor-intensive economy that we see emerging out of many of the economic policies of the government for the past 10 years, despite a lot of the promises of creating new jobs. Especially also for jobs for women. And the other problem with the economy, obviously, 6 to 8% is something that many economies would like to have. It shows a certain stable kind of growth, economic growth over the last 2-3 decades. It's something that predated even the BJP government. But a lot of issues are about if you disaggregate and look at other indicators, that despite this strong growth, it has led to lack of progress in GDP per capita. India is not well ranked when you look. It's one of the fastest big economies, but it's not showing progress in GDP per capita. In Human Development Index, which takes into account literacy and other factors, and obviously still a growing inflation, which is something, again, many other economies in the world are facing, but is a problematic, obviously, in India, especially because inflation is severely felt also in agricultural products, and it's still a very strongly an economy that's depending strongly again on agriculture. So, again, there's all these kinds of problems that the government has not been able to address. There's a nice narrative with the stability and growth, which actually attracts some investments. If some of the success stories of Apple, for instance, iPhones being now moved. India is benefiting from the decoupling or de-risking of investment in China, and there's a lot of iPhone factories now opening in India. But this is sort of a story that doesn't fit the complete narrative. There's still limiting foreign the direct investments in India, also limited investments within India by the local economic players, and so because there's still not a complete confidence despite the strong growth numbers. So this is a more complex story. Obviously, it's still, again, doing better on certain aggregate economic indicators than many other economies, and that could lead to further investments in the future. But there's some issues about, is this an equitable or distributed economic growth? Because a lot of issues and this is not something that's limited to India. Again, you see this a little bit in the US or Brazil. So there's actually a small group of population, the top 1%, as we commonly use that term, is benefiting more from the growth of the economy than other actors at the local or national level. So there's a recent article from Piketty and other authors that show that actually India, the inequalities in India are higher right now than they used to be under the British Raj or the British colonial empire. And they call it the billionaire Raj, right? So that it benefits a small number, or not small number, it's actually one of the biggest population of billionaires now is based in India. So that's some of the issues and criticisms that have come up within India. Now, welfare programs. That's also still an issue that always comes up during elections. There's often the incumbent or the opposition, they offer and the promise to deliver certain kind of welfare schemes to the population, etc. So in these welfare schemes, you have the typical supply of public goods, so free healthcare, access to education, etc. That is the typical kind of contestation between different political parties about which can offer the best kind of public goods, public services. What some argue that happened under Modi for the past 10 years, and actually opposition parties have picked up on it, or state parties have picked up on it, and also are offering similar services now, is that it actually moves beyond the traditional kind of public good schemes that have been offered by incumbent governments or opposition, that now you try to offer also subsidize what would be considered in private goods or private services. So access to electricity, help for housing, help and access to bank, or cooking gas access. So there's a famous scheme about the delivery or or getting a certain kind of subsidy of money to be able to buy specific cylinder of cooking gas. So again, these different services have been regularly offered by this government under different kind of schemes over the last 10 years at both the local and the national level. And what's interesting about one other new feature under Modi that changed compared to previous government is actually delivered directly via what the Modi government has been promoting a lot and been somewhat successful, is what they call the digital public infrastructure, right? It's more digital kind of schemes. The payments, the subsidies that I mentioned to have access to certain kind of these private goods are made directly through the digital kind of ways, notably access. Most of Indian population has 5G phones, basically, so they get their payments directly through their phones, and often these are directly, you get basically the attribution is directly to Modi. You have directly the BJP or the Modi picture app appearing almost on your phones or on the website where you can download the information to get these schemes. You obviously is direct personal attribution of a lot of these services to the personality of Modi or to the BJP, and mainly so this new direct exchange or direct delivery from without the middleman, without the bureaucracy, it's led to less cost. It's less costly, less cumbersome for the population, but also creates this different connection, the connection with the population, and may be more politically interesting for the BJP and Modi because directly attributable or directly direct credit goes to the BJP and to Modi personally. So this is a new kind of system that you saw also over the last few months as the run-up to elections, they offer new schemes and the offer of these new digital means to deliver them. So that's a new development, I think, in these elections compared to previous elections. So that's some of the main issue about the economy. It's also important to talk a little bit about some of the controversies and concerns. And here I'm picking up mainly on the international coverage of these elections since January. And you might have seen this picture, right? Most of you might have seen it. So this happened late January in Ayodhya, in Uttar Pradesh. I mentioned the most populous Indian state. And Narendra Modi, Prime Minister of India, was actually officiated for the opening of a new a temple dedicated to Ram, the warrior king, and basically on this hill in Ayodhya, where it was supposed to, which was supposed to be the site of his birth. But the problem is this temple, it was built on the site where a mosque built in the 16th century was destroyed by a group of mob in 1992. And since then, since 1992, when that mosque was destroyed by basically a mob that was directed mainly by personalities close to the BJP. This has been a litigation about the axis, or what would they do with that site that was contested by both a Muslim and a Hindu population. And the Supreme Court decided that obviously there was shared kind of a responsibility on this site, because it's not clear again if this was actually the site of the birth of Ram. There's archaeological survey evidence that seems to show it, but there was also a mosque that was destroyed there. So the court decided not really to make a strong decision in one way or the other, but still allowed the building of a new temple, which was inaugurated again in January. Now the question is, why would a prime minister of a secular, again, a republic, be administering the opening of a Hindu temple when you're talking about a multi-religious, multicultural kind of democracy, right? So that created some kind of questions about the separation between religion again and politics, especially especially from some religious minorities, including the Muslim minority, because obviously this was the site of a mosque. So, and the fact that it happened in January, what you have to also know, the opening, the inauguration was supposedly also accelerated. It was supposed to happen later in the year after the elections. So obviously this was also accelerated maybe to fit an electoral campaigning kind of schedule, right? So obviously for the BJP, it has been a long promise of the BJP in its different manifestos to reopen or to build this temple. So this is also Modi showing that he delivers, and his party deliver on some of these long-held promises. And so obviously this is consolidating one, but not the only constituency or voting coalition behind the BJP, but it's the Hindu nationalist kind of voting base. Obviously, there's a sense of pride among many Hindus in India about the opening of this temple. That was felt if you look at surveys across. If you know about some of the different festivals in India, notably the Holi festival that happens later in the year, that people were arguing that basically the celebrations look almost like Holi was happening in January on the day of the opening of the Ram Mandir, the Ram temple. So this is something that also created some kind of questions about the communal relations and the place of religion, especially a majority in religion. 80% of the population is Hindu in India, 15% Muslim. So created some questions about the politics of this. There's also been, you might have heard about this. This is a follow-up to the 2019 election. There was two set of reforms that happened soon after the 2019 election. So first, there was the Citizen Amendment Act. So that was a reform that supposedly gave fastened or facilitated the obtention of Indian citizenship for religious minorities in some of the neighboring states in South Asia, from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. It opened the possibility for basically persecuted religious minorities to obtain Indian citizenship, but only for some religions, not all. It opened it for Hindus, obviously, Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, but not Muslims, right? So Ahmadiyas or Shias that could be persecuted maybe in Pakistan, Afghanistan, or Bangladesh would not be offered the same kind of fastened or facilitated citizenship, possibly. So that was one of those reforms that happened and already created. Why would you create these different treatments of different kind of for different religions? That already created also a set of questions about the secular kind of nature of Indian politics. But alongside this, and again, what you have to know, it's 2019 when this was first suggested, early 2020, when it was passed in Parliament, it wasn't implemented because there's a lot of demonstration, riots, and it wasn't implemented until a month ago, right? A month ago, for 5 years, this government sat on it and decided to finally implement it a month ago. So that led obviously to questions about, again, the timing and what it means maybe for electoral purposes. Alongside in 2019, also the National Registry of Citizens. So this is another reform about a registry of citizens that wanted to determine along certain citizens, certain regions, notably Assam, which is one of the bordering states to Bangladesh, with basically our people that were in the state of Assam needed to prove that they were citizens since this particular date. They needed to show documents showing this. And after the National Registry of Citizens was first implemented, or the first kind of survey happened, 4 million citizens, or formerly citizens of the state of Assam, were basically their citizenship was put into doubt, into question, because they couldn't offer the proper documentation. Now, a lot of them could easily get maybe back their Indian citizenship through the CAA or other possibilities, but obviously those Muslim minorities within those 4 million citizens, those that were in a bit of limbo, had maybe more difficulties proving their citizenship or getting back their citizenship. So the conjunction and the chronology between these two reforms created this impression. Again, it's not completely proven, but this could create this impression over the long term, as these are two implemented alongside each other, that there could be this creation of these disenfranchisement or these two-tiered citizenship. That's what is criticism about that from the opposition, from the media, from some NGOs about these two reforms. So again, creating some unease and problems within communal religions in India, and the politicization of it. So that's one issue. The other issue that might have come up, and you might have heard of it in this election, is the increasing issues about media and disinformation. Now, that's not completely an issue that's specific to India. It's an issue that often comes up. Oh, and yeah, so just before I move to media and disinformation, I forgot this happened 2 days ago. Modi was I think in Rajasthan, one Indian state in the northern India, made a few statements also that were criticized by the opposition as targeting one particular minority, notably Muslims, talking about Muslims in India, or at least maybe referring to those that I mentioned in Assam that have moved to India from Bangladesh as infiltrators. That was the term that he used. And there could be a problem about redistributive policies. I remember the schemes I mentioned. And he made an argument that the Congress had been redistributing more to religious minorities than the BJP, and that this minority was, they had more children than the Hindu population. So there was these statements that were, obviously criticized, singled out by the opposition, and there's been reports to the Electoral Commission, which should check if there are terms that are used, communal or religious terms that are used for electoral purposes. So we'll see how that goes, but I wanted to mention that because obviously that came up and was criticized both in national and international media. But now moving to media and disinformation. That's actually not a specific issue to India. There are AI tools, deepfakes, that are discussed across the board, and they could in fact also US elections, notably. But here, in India, it's another scale. We mentioned the scale of the electoral process, but obviously also in the use of these tools. And now what we've seen is avatars of Modi or Rahul Gandhi basically addressing voters by name, so very specifically, individually being sent and addressing their voters by name, speaking of one of the 18 official languages in India. And so experts have been obviously see that this could be used in a tool for disinformation. Now, why is that important? Because in India, it's a wide internet usage, right? Notably to get information. 866 million Indians use the internet, have access to, I say, those 5G phones. And a lot of Indians actually get information, political information, that shapes a little bit their decision to vote on WhatsApp. WhatsApp is one of the main, well, it's not the only source, but one of the main source of information, notably a lot of WhatsApp groups about sharing these kind of information, sharing videos with these potentially deepfakes or other electoral information. So that's another issue, the issue about the concerns about rising disinformation on social media. Another issue that came up is crackdown on critical media, both international media, international coverage, and local media. This is something that's been highlighted many times by Reporters Without Borders, or these different indexes about press freedom. India is not ranking really well in some of these, notably more in the TV media. There's been criticism that a lot of the TV media are held or owned by a couple of oligarchs, some that are historical connections from with Narendra Modi from his time when he was chief minister or the elected high political representative in Gujarat. So those are questions that come up. But I mean, that's again an issue that is also discussed about the ownership of certain media in also other countries. But also what's come up is the criticism about the coverage, the coverage of the elections by international media. So you might have heard this morning there was an Australian correspondent from the ABC that just revealed that she had been asked on Friday, the day when the election started, to leave the country because of her reporting, and that she would not get a license to be able to cover the election. So that was obviously picked up, and since then I had a petition by most of the foreign correspondents from Western European countries or the US that criticized this and actually criticized also the way the government is giving access or not to cover the election. So this is not something that's this is something that the international media is talking about, that there is some pressure or some happening directly or indirectly from the government when it comes to coverage of the elections. So I would refer to those latest developments and that petition from the correspondents, which leads to another question. And again, this free and fair election is not an absolute. It's by degrees. There's always criticism about the leveling field when it comes to different elections. You have institutions like Freedom House or VDEM, Varieties of Democracy, based in Stockholm, that compete and try to look at the different ways, we should look at elections. Are elections all free and fair because they're held regularly, and you have or should we also look at the nature of the leveling field and the competitiveness? Is there regular political transitions happening, etc.? What happened that is, to some degree, puzzling in India is there's two issues that came up. One is that over the last few months in the run-up to the election. One is that you might have heard or not is the electoral bonds issue. And that's linked to political funding, electoral funding. For a long time in India, when Congress was in power, and notably, there were questions about dark or black money in India. That cash that with no accountability, no tracing mechanism, that would be delivered for different parties during the elections to fund the electoral campaigning. The Modi government suggested a solution to try to address the issue of dark money by creating what they call the electoral bonds in 2017, 2018. These were bonds that donors, individual or different corporate organizations could pay or could buy in the State Bank of India, the SBI, and these could be then given to the party that they had decided they would give this bond to. That was done in a supposedly anonymous way, because the State Bank of India would get the donation, would then allocate it to a party without giving the identity of the actor that had bought that bond. So supposedly that created a field where you didn't have quid pro quos because the identity of the donors wasn't transparent, wasn't completely divulged. But the problem is the State Bank of India is an institution controlled by the government of India. So the criticism that came is the government in India actually had all the information about the donors and where the donors were giving the money to, which party the donors were giving the money to, etc. And if they were not giving money directly to the NDA or the incumbent coalition. So the Supreme Court decided in February of this year to invalidate and to decide that the electoral bond scheme was unconstitutional, and asked the government and the State Bank of India actually to divulge all the information about donations since 2019, since the last election. So the State Bank of India has provided a lot of information, not directly linking parties to these bonds. This has been then progressively investigated by some journalists. But obviously what you saw in the aggregate numbers already, that the electoral bond scheme has primarily benefited the BJP, right? The incumbent government. So again, this is an ongoing litigated issue, but obviously the Supreme Court has decided this was not the way to address the issue of dark money going to funding. But the BJP stands by it. Modi has, again, in an interview a couple of days ago, said that the electoral bond scheme would maybe come back if they get reelected, but obviously in a different way because of the issues that the Supreme Court mentioned. The other issue is that come up in the run-up to the election is the use of investigative body. These are national institutions that are controlled to some degree by the government, like the Enforcement Directorate or the different tax services, the Internal Tax Department. These have been criticized for targeting maybe disproportionately opposition leaders over the last few weeks in the run-up to the election. These are supposedly that work to ensure basically to fight against corruption or corruption schemes, etc. And the biggest issue, might have heard about this, was the arrest of one important opposition leader. This is Arvind Kejriwal, the chief minister of New Delhi, so the highest elected representative of the New Delhi constituency, and was arrested a few weeks ago. So basically, a little bit more than a month before the national elections. So it was there's a liquor corruption scam license issue that's led to this arrest and accusations from actually some of the people linked to that investigation. But the issue is the arrest of a prominent political personality for a corruption scheme is pretty much unprecedented, so close to the election. So that has raised issues about the timing, right? But obviously this is still being litigated, so it's not, obviously this is a little bit more complex, but obviously the timing raises some questions. So the questions is about the free and fair nature of these elections in this particular 2019 election. And the last thing I'll mention is about the elections and the connection to foreign policy. What could happen in foreign policy, and how foreign policy might have also influenced the existing elections. But one thing you have to know about Indian foreign policy, it hasn't been really there haven't been many partisan divides, not very contested, politicized. Usually there were a lot of arguments in a lot of articles after Modi got elected that he would pursue the same kind of foreign policy. And in the broad lines, he pursued a very similar policy than the Congress did before. Back in the days of Congress, it was called non-alignment, which was India's position when it comes to keeping kind of a degree of strategic autonomy. Under the Modi regime, it's called multi-alignment, right? But it's pretty much follows kind of the same broad patterns. So continuity has been the norm. And actually, some of you might have attended Rahul Gandhi, so the head of the Indian National Congress, came to The Hague in September. He gave a presentation at the Leiden University, and he pretty much gave the same talking points that Modi gave at the G20. So you see that there's actually a kind of cross-partisan kind of consensus on some issues. But it's true that especially since 2019, which arguably was also an election that was politicized, where foreign policy was politicized, especially the reaction of the Modi government to attacks coming from Pakistan at the time, that there's been, Modi and the BJP have put their stamp on some foreign policy initiatives. One is obviously during the context of the G20 that was held last September in India, a strong promotion of India's global role and unique position in geopolitics today, right? India tries to seize itself between the North and the South, between democracies and other countries, between established and development and established economies and developing economies, etc. So it sees itself as a unique position to understand and to conciliate positions of these different kind of blocs, coalitions in the international system. So it sees itself, and especially advocated being the voice of the global South during the G20, bring a lot of the issues, interests, concerns of the global South in the context of the G20. So it sees itself as a bridging power. This is a concept that's long existed in Indian foreign policy jargon since Congress, but has been more prominent, I think, under the BJP. Sometimes you see the concept of being a Southwest power, right? A power that's both in the South and the West. And it's actually really much reciprocated because you see India very central, especially if you look at Western European powers or the US. India often comes up in a very central role as a central node in a lot of the Indo-Pacific strategies, right? A lot of the focus has been from a lot of the Western countries towards the Indo-Pacific, and India is seen as a strong partner, like-minded partner in that region. So it's central to a lot of those Indo-Pacific strategies, and even in this India, Middle East, Europe corridor that was announced at the G20. Obviously, India has a strong node there, through which much of the trade with the Indo-Pacific would go through, then through the Middle East all the way to Europe. So India places itself also in a central position when it comes to that new major economic corridor that would emerge. Now, that's for the positioning of India at the international level and leveraging this for strategic purposes. But also, it's a crucial strategy for domestic politics, because India uses a lot of these, a lot of its image and its the fact that Modi would get the red carpet rolled out when he goes to Washington or Paris in June and July 2023. That is used also and showed and broadcasted very heavily in this campaign. That Modi has put India on the map, has put India in this kind of central position where it's actually greeted and welcomed and embraced by most important strategic partners in the world. And that can be leveraged for India's economy. So what you see in this particular picture, I thought it was very interesting. The publication, the kind of publicization or broadcasting of the G20 happening in New Delhi, Modi's personality being hosted. It seemed almost, when you go to Delhi, I was there during the foreign minister meet of the G20, it seemed almost like it wasn't India that was hosting, it was Modi hosting the G20 and these different foreign ministers coming. And here you see, this is actually the G20, and Modi's personality are also there to deliver these important schemes that I mentioned. Development is universal and all-inclusive, so mixing the international and the domestic delivery and especially so using this obviously for electoral purposes in the context of India. And two other cases I want to mention about foreign policy beyond the use of India's global positioning also for electoral purposes is two recent cases, more smaller cases, which highlight how foreign policy issues have been politicized in this particular election. One of them is that you might have even never heard of, is the Kachatevu controversy. Has anyone ever heard of this? The Kachatevu island? No? It's normal that you haven't heard. It was not a very salient issue. I actually never heard of it before the External Affairs Minister of India brought it up a few weeks ago. It's basically this island that was contested since the independence of Sri Lanka and India from the British Empire. And in 1974, the two countries have decided to agree that it would become sovereign territory of Sri Lanka, and India got another territory in concession, and that basically de-escalated some of the regional border tensions between the two countries, right? Now, you thought that was non-salient resolved, but a couple of weeks ago, it was brought up again by the BJP, and notably through the voice of the External Affairs Minister, that this had been that the Indian National Congress had sold out or conceded without any great gains this island to Sri Lanka. It's an important salient issue in Tamil Nadu, that sovereign state that I mentioned earlier, politics, because there are a lot of fishermen could benefit from the maritime kind of domain around that island. So it was a salient issue for the BJP to make inroads in the Tamil electorate in that sovereign state, where the BJP has not been very popular in the past. So see how the foreign policy issues could be could be used for electoral purposes, especially in states where the BJP has not done well. But that's been criticized indirectly by the Sri Lankan government that doesn't really know what to do with this new claim. And also, it has been criticized by a lot of former retired diplomats that have been involved in some of the negotiations, saying, why would you put this back on the table when we had an agreement and a long-held agreement with Sri Lanka about this? So that's one controversy that was interesting, came up only for seemingly for political reasons. The other issues you might have heard about the criticism against India's potential targeted killing program. There was the issue about, again, a Canadian national killed on Canadian soil, the accusation directly from Prime Minister Trudeau of Indian interference, also from the US about an attempted killing of a Sikh nationalist also in the US, but also there was a Guardian article a couple of weeks ago, a very detailed report about India actually also killing potential terrorists that have struck India or could strike India on Pakistani territory. Now, the Minister of External Affairs immediately denied any intervention, any involvement in these, and denied what was said in that report. But it's interesting that a couple of days after the denial, that official denial from the Ministry of External Affairs, India's Defense Minister, Rajnath Singh, actually double down, say India will enter Pakistan to kill terrorists when he was asked questions or when this was mentioned, this was actually mentioned. So, and Modi, Prime Minister Modi, also on the campaign trail, also mentioned that India would strike in other territories when it feels that its national security is at stake. So this is something that has been used to some degree indirectly also for electoral gains. So this is again a new development in that the politicization of Indian foreign policy in this particular election. So I'll conclude. Because I've been talking a lot, but I want to open up to the discussion. The question is now, will the BJP win a third consecutive term? I say my answer, and you can hold me to it on June 4th, is probably yes. The question is more by how much, right? There's questions about the 370. Right now it's 301, right, seats, 370 seats, which would give it a very strong majority, which could mean potential the potential to reform the constitution in a decisive way. There's also the talk of the 400-seat threshold, which was, for instance, attained by the Rajiv Gandhi government in the 1980s. So that's something that the BJP has in sight. But it's not clear because the BJP needs to still make inroads in what I said, the sovereign Indian states. So one thing that you will see probably in this election is this strong division. You see in 2014, but it was actually strong domination of the BJP in the north center. This was actually consolidated in 2019, and you might see this as a strong division between the south and the north, strong domination of the BJP in the north, and strong domination of Congress and sovereign regional parties in the south. So this is something that will become, there's a lot of articles about the north-south divide that could be emerging be more and more salient in Indian politics. Now, does this mean that the BJP is on to being almost an unopposed political force in Indian elections? Can the moderate democracy be competitive again? And I use moderate democracy. That's a term used a lot by Modi and the BJP. It's basically a term that's been used also in international summits, arguing that India has a slightly different history of democracy that predates the modern federal parliamentary republic of 1950, and that there was actually already engagement with feature of democracy, might be slightly different than the Western models, and that India so then has as much to instruct to the world on democracy and democratic attributes than the Western democracies, that the older Western democracies like the US and Western Europe. So this is another argument that's brought up by the BJP, but will these be competitive again? And depending on the electoral outcome and how Modi will leverage this at the international level for its foreign policy, how will Modi's India be viewed internationally? And you have this interesting tweet that I don't know if you saw about the BJP pushing for more votes, vote for the BJP and make Bharat a superpower globally, target audience, India, actual audience, the world, right? So to make Bharat is the other term used by India to label India. They're both words, Bharat and India in the constitution, but the BJP the last few months in this campaign has been using Bharat more systematically than India. Make Bharat a global superpower, vote for BJP. So the international implications and the use of international relations in the context of domestic politics. I'll conclude on that note about the linkages between the two, and I look forward to your questions, comments, and criticisms. Again, simplifying a little bit a lot of complex processes. So, thank you for your attention.
Well, Nicolas, thank you so much. Maybe a first question before we go to the audience. I'm wondering if you highlight these issues of, well, media, disinformation, crackdowns, Hindu-Muslim tensions, can it be said that India is becoming a more authoritative and less democratic country currently?
So there's a debate on that, right? There's a strong criticism of I mentioned the varieties of democracy, which is an index of that basically labels or ranks in different countries, whether they're established liberal democracies or not. In India, in that ranking, it has been called electoral autocracy, right? There are a lot of criticisms of the indicators used for that particular ranking and that particular labeling of India. Actually, if you look at the US has not been doing very well on the VDEM ranking too. So that's one question that's being debated. There are questions that have been asked about the free and fair nature of the elections, which explain why these questions about electoral autocracy are coming up, that if there's a single party that keeps winning, even if you held elections regularly, elections are not sufficient to make it liberal democracy. You need to have a free and fair kind of leveling field. So that's one question that's been asked about these issues that have been happening in the run-up to this election, right? The fact that there's been potentially use of investigative agencies to target opposition leaders, the use of the lopsidedness nature of the funding, kind of electoral funding that pretty much favors the BJP. We'll see now that the electoral bonds don't exist, if we could have more of an equal chance for different parties. But again, these issues come up, and arguably is there maybe a dominance or hegemony of the BJP for years to come, and all that impacts the institution. The other argument about autocracy could come up with the centralization of power, right? You have one party that's in power, basically you have an NDA, a coalition, but one party could rule by itself. And one party is very dominated by one personality. So the centralization of power among, with one personality, one party that both dominates the national elections, but also the BJP is in control of many other states, state assemblies, through alone or with coalitions. So that means that a lot of the political destiny or trajectory of India is decided by one party, one group of people, right? So that creates also criticism of potential moves towards centralized kind of political system. Some would call it autocracy, but again, I wouldn't get in that debate. I think we're not in the presence of autocracy, but obviously there's clearly questions about centralization of political power. And that's not something new to India. It also happened under Indira Gandhi, that there was a strong centralization around Indira Gandhi, that she controlled most states, she controlled the national institutions, and then at one point suspended the constitution for 2 years. So that's often, and actually the BJP often brings up that we're not in the domain or the field that of domination that Indira Gandhi was in, and we obviously have there could be criticisms, but there are free or fair elections that are held every 5 years, etc. Yeah, so that's what they would answer.
We'll see what happens
Yeah.
in the future.
Yeah.
If there's any questions, my colleague has a microphone, so please raise your hand and she'll come towards you. One all the way, one in the front and one all the way over there.
Just wondering if New Delhi votes differently from the rest of the country, or like maybe the higher class votes differently, and they choose a conservative going with BJP, or if there's a difference between votings.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, there's two set of answers here. There's one, the urban-rural kind of divide. Yeah, for the when it comes to BJP votes, actually, the BJP used to be a very much urban votes back in the 1990s, early 2000s, and there's been a much stronger rural vote for the BJP also in the last few years. It's so I'm talking about the personality and charisma of Modi that has helped the BJP win elections. But it shouldn't also marginalize the role of grassroots movements happening at the BJP, for the BJP in different states. And so there's been a stronger rural vote for the BJP over the years, at the detriment of Congress, but also of regional parties. So that's something that's evolved. And notably the access of, I was mentioning the access of internet media has also helped also develop the personality of Modi, and the direct delivery of services also helped the BJP. When it comes to specifically New Delhi, as I mentioned, Arvind Kejriwal was the chief minister of New Delhi, so the highest elected representative on that local assembly. He's basically the head of the Aam Aadmi Party, the party of the people. That's a party that dominates New Delhi and has won now 2 elections against the BJP. That may be why the BJP was not happy with the personality of Kejriwal as an opponent, because they haven't found a way to beat him in the Delhi constituency. And it's a party that also runs one other state, is the state of Punjab. So it's a party that's recent. It came out of an anti-corruption movement against Congress in the early 2010s, and has been, despite a small party organization, has been developing and using Delhi as a sort of experiment, showing good governance, or some kind of what they call good governance, non-corrupt, but again, Arvind Kejriwal was arrested on a corruption scheme, could actually be a counter-model to both Congress and the BJP, right? So that's a new development in New Delhi politics. New Delhi used to be dominated by the Congress, then BJP, and now it's ruled by this particular party. So Delhi does do a little bit things differently, but than the rest of the country, but Punjab, and there's other states where the IAP, the Aam Aadmi Party, is doing relatively well in elections, not enough to win, but Goa and Gujarat, they've been getting more votes in the last few elections, local elections. So there's new political force that first emerged in New Delhi. Yeah.
Hi, sorry, I don't have a question, but I'm honestly from Delhi. I am from India. And not a question, but just a compliment that I learned more about my country as well from this session. And I think very informative and very accurate also at the same time. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you.
That's a great compliment. There's another question, two other questions over here.
Sorry.
You'll be next.
Hi, thank you for the super informative talk. I was wondering if you could comment on how the siege in Jammu and Kashmir, like how has that influenced the political discourse? I think that there has also been some instrumentalization of the history of that area in the last years. I remember there was a really big blockbuster movie, I think, in 2023 about the tensions that have been around there for a long time. And I thought that was really, I was there at the time when the movie was airing, and I found it really striking how people just went to see that movie, for example, and like they really, there's this super strong impulse to just really feed into the propaganda, and like this unwillingness to accept any criticism towards Modi. I think that's really fascinating, and how he. I'll end it there. I could talk about this for hours.
No,
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Could you maybe clarify what the siege in Kashmir was?
It's a complex issue, so I don't know. I'll try to explain in a couple of minutes. So you're mentioning the movie you mentioned first. Let's talk about that. Article 370, I think, is the name of the movie. It's a blockbuster that did pretty well in India the last few weeks or months. I forget when exactly came out, but it refers to the Article 370 was part of the Constitution of 1950, which gave an autonomous status to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Jammu and Kashmir is a state that was contested between Pakistan and India. That's part of the Kashmir state that has, after the first initial war between India and Pakistan, became Indian territory or Indian administered Kashmir. And the state of Jammu and Kashmir in the first constitution had a specific autonomous status. It's also the only Muslim majority state in India. What the BJP has done for years, and this is not new, but it happened only in 2019, in this manifesto, there was actually a criticism for a long time in its different electoral manifestos that the state of Jammu and Kashmir should not have an autonomous status. There shouldn't be one particular exception for one state, right? And so they always ran onto rescinding the autonomous status of the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And they did that. They did that in 2019 after their re-election. They actually, in the summer of 2019, they went back and rescinded the autonomous status, and they also they rescinded the state status also of Jammu and Kashmir. It became a set of union territories. 2 union territories, basically, which are a separate subnational kind of political administrative unit in India. Since then, there has been basically, I don't know if the word siege, but I mean, there's been a lockdown, basically, mostly administered by the Indian military, and there hasn't been, it's with very limited possibility to have, there hasn't been any elections, there hasn't been any, there's been supposedly a lot of reports. It's difficult to access to access that particular state, but obviously a lot of criticism of political repression of local politics and the local population. So that's been for the past 5 years, and there's also a complete lockdown also in access to these media I mentioned, no access to internet, etc. So there's also very limited access to information in the initial days or months after the rescinding of the state of Jammu and Kashmir. So that's been a major problem, and complicated, still ongoing. What to do about that particular those particular territories and how to implement actual and bring back a sort of political process there. So that's still an ongoing issue since the last election. Yeah, it's been obviously criticized in the international media. There have been delegations of MPs from abroad that visited, but hasn't been any strong political movement internationally to try to provide more political, give back some kind of political voice to that part of India. And obviously, it's been used a lot. It was a long-held electoral promise that the BJP is making a strong argument in the run-up to the election that it's been holding its long electoral promises, whether it's the reopening of the Hindu temple, the opening of the Hindu temple in Ayodhya, whether it is the rescinding the Article 370 and other issues that were in their manifestos. So it's a very politically complicated situation. Yeah, I don't know if I answered very comprehensively or satisfactorily, but yeah, it's an issue and I would say something though. It's true that the BJP has changed the status of Jammu and Kashmir, and that's created a set of new political problems. But it's true that under Congress and other governments, coalitions held by other governments, since the late 80s, there's been this problem about depriving also political liberties to the Jammu and Kashmir Assembly, right? The election results of the early 80s were also not authorized, not recognized by the central government, and there was already a sort of martial kind of law already since the late 80s, early 90s. There was a strong repression against what was perceived as a local insurgency. So that's also been going on for a while, unfortunately, and it has escalated with the 2019 decision. Yeah.
Do you think that's benefiting them right now in the discourse, like leading up to the elections, or not?
Clearly, because for them, it's this discourse that where the Congress and other previous polities had created these exceptional statuses for certain religious minorities, mainly Muslim minorities, with the civil code, for instance, the Muslim civil code, but also with the status of Kashmir. And again, so this is something that they've been promoting for a while. That they basically do not think there should be these concessions to these minority status, right? So again, this is through Kashmir and through other kind of political reforms they pushed. And again, this was one of the longest held promises since the BJP came to be. It always promised that we would come back on Kashmir. And so it's using that also to show that it is going back on its promises, and it is holding by its promises, and it hasn't ceded on concession. It hasn't done any concessions on the Kashmir issue. So yeah, I would say it still comes up and it builds on the popularity of that movie that you mentioned, the Article 370. Yeah, or the Kashmir Files is another previous movie that also talked about the persecution of Hindus in Jammu, in the Jammu Valley. Yeah, which is also another issue which is very politicized.
There's another hand in the audience.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for the interesting talk. And you talked a lot about these domestic issues, so like the free elections, the media coverage, the Muslim minorities. And there's quite a lot of international criticism about this, so you talked also about these rankings and stuff. But for me, it's really difficult when I read the news about India, whether these issues are felt domestically strongly in the country itself. So how is that? Is this alive? Is this a thing? Could you say something about that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So there's the international criticisms that I mentioned, the international democratic rankings, and also the international coverage of the election. But there's also questions about the coverage, or are these concerns also widely felt or expressed at the national level? And one of the answers we'll get is the result of the election. If people actually think that the participation and the support for the BJP is this actually, do they also perceive that this is lopsided and the BJP is actually is there a creeping kind of centralization or autocratic regime? And that I don't think it's perceived the same way, given the popularity of the BJP. It's more felt, and again, it's not a national sentiment. It's more felt, again, I said, the North-South divide. The South it clearly thinks that it's going to be, that clearly is more concerned about the evolution of the political system in India than the North. So again, it's more not a homogeneous, I think, realization of where things are going. You see also in the media, I mentioned about the critical media. If you look at the written press, and notably a few online sources that are considered to be independent, but again, there's always a question about where the funding comes from, are very critical about the regime, and those are double down on the criticism of the arrest of Arjun Kejriwal and other things. So these are obviously pointing out a lot of the concerns. But I guess in most of the surveys that we see about going to the polls, these concerns are not widely shared, and Modi and the BJP are very popular. So, and there's also a pushback against international criticism, right? You know, that is still it's the standards that are used by Western democracies are not maybe applicable to the Indian context, or not. The Indian context, I mean, the sheer scale of the election, the fact that India has been a very functioning democracy since the 1950s. This argument about the modern democracy, that India has also very different, maybe democratic characteristics that are different, that have a different history than in the West. This also comes up in the rhetoric to criticize criticism from abroad. And on the international ranking, so varieties of democracy, polity, or Freedom House are used to look at that India, there's been what they call a democratic backsliding, basically. India, the government has announced indirectly that one think tank in India, the Observer Research Foundation, would develop a different index for the ranking of democracies, building on an input from India's own researchers, basically, and would offer a different type of ranking. That's been just announced. It's not clear how they're going to do it, what kind of indicators they'll use, but this is something that they want to put out because they think these different institutions I mentioned, Polity, Freedom House, based in Washington, and the other one based in Stockholm, are biased vis-a-vis India, and maybe other global South democracies. That's at least the narrative at the international level. Yeah. Thank you.
I think we have room for 2 more questions, and that's it. Those 2 in the middle.
Thank you for the talk. I think just kind of voicing out one of the things maybe that also answer this question is BJP's major kind of agenda has also been to devaluate Congress and especially Rahul Gandhi as an opposition. Mm-hmm. Could you speak a little bit more to that? I mean, you know, there's been a lot of kind of talks even in like political rallies and parties about how Rahul Gandhi is not even a valid kind of opposition that people should be voting for.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of criticism over the years about the Gandhi family from the BJP, and obviously political dynasties. That it's so this issue about that this kind of privileged kind of positioning, or that the party is basically owned by one family, etc. So there's been that criticism, obviously, about, which is rich when you think that. It's not, Modi obviously is not part of a political dynasty, actually he comes from he's the first time an engagement in the BJP, etc. But there are political dynasties across India. If you look at regional parties, there's also different family members that have been in power in different places. So, but there's clearly that argument of political dynasty. There's the argument about the motivation and the interest of Rahul Gandhi in actual politics. They criticize that he's traveling abroad all the time, that he's not actually in a sustained fashion engaged with politics, that he has never been in power, he has never taken a ministerial position, that he doesn't want to be directly in a position of leadership. That's often come up. And there's the other issues about his national allegiance has also come up, right? Because his grandfather was a Parsi, basically, so of another religious minority. So that also is sometimes come up, but also his mother is Italian, right? So that often comes up about his mixed potential political allegiance, that he's not completely involved in the national project again. So those are all the criticism that are used to, and also corruption, that Congress has been in power for so many years. The last term of the Indian National Congress under Manmohan Singh was also mired with corruption scandals. So again, there's always this criticism about Congress and its link to corruption scandals from the 90s and then the 2000s tenure. So those are all used to kind of devaluating Rahul Gandhi as a candidate and the Congress more generally. Yeah.
On to the final question. So I'll hand over there.
Again, thank you so much for the informative talk. I come from a media background, so the topic of the influence of the movie industry is very interesting for me. And to my knowledge, I know that the movie industry in the South especially has a huge influence on the on who gets to go into politics.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that a bit more?
It's very interesting. The media, movies and politics is very important, especially in the South. Tamil Nadu is a state I mentioned. The ad of the two big parties I mentioned, the AIDMK and the DMK, were actually, until recently, linked to the movie industry, right? The ad of the IDMK was an actress, and her partner was at the head of the party. Had been two famous actor in local Tamil cinema, and the head of the traditional historical head of the DMK was a screenwriter for a lot of famous Tamil movies. So the name recognition, the popularity of Tamil cinema helped to have a political career, etc. And there's a lot of themes within these movies that are about also socio-economic, political issues, etc. So that's always been something very important in Tamil Nadu, but not, Tamil Nadu in politics, but there's also, we see this happening in also other states, but it's very strong, obviously, in Tamil Nadu. There's been a lot of articles, and this I'm not an expert, about the last few years under the Modi regime, the Modi tenures, that there's been a politicization of Bollywood and other broader cinema in India. More and more political topics that have been the subject or the focus of a lot of Bollywood movies, and this is new. There's always been politics in Bollywood and in cinema, but this was a little bit more explicit and direct over the last few years. So, and criticisms about it, because it's not very subtle. Doesn't lead to great cinema. I saw a few critics saying this. We mentioned Article 370, the Kashmir Files. It's become almost those arguments in some of the articles I read. And again, I'm not an expert. It's more political propaganda than it is cinema or artistic, right? So that's some of the criticism I saw. And again, to finish is on you mentioned Tamil. I mentioned Tamil cinema, the regional politics dimension, the language, the politics of it. That you need to preserve these also. Local language cinema and films is also something that is important in the Indian politics, right? That the domination of the Hindi North, and that's notably also in cinema, is something that is resisted to some degree by these local cinemas and very important historical culture, which links then to linguistic politics also. So also I'll mention that. I think it's also important. But again, I'm not a media cinema expert, so I just read a little bit about the connections to the politics. Yeah. So hopefully that answers some of your questions. Yeah.
I think it's the end of our time. If there are any remaining questions, I am sure Nicolas, if he has some time, is willing to answer them after the lecture. Before we go, I want to thank you all for being here, and I want one more round of applause for Dr. Nicolas Blarel. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the great questions.